20 doctors failed with his illness. But a waitress achieved the impossible, and the millionaire did not. The hush in the private hospital suite was so absolute that it seemed the walls themselves were holding their breath. Julian Crestwood, a man whose name alone could stir markets and ignite entire industries, lay motionless on a bed draped in fine Egyptian cotton. The monitors beside him pulsed with cruel indifference, broadcasting the steady decline of a body science could no longer salvage. 20 specialists from around the globe, neurologists, immunologists, alternative healers, had arrived and departed like grim pilgrims, each offering a diagnosis more hopeless than the last. Outside, the city churned on, oblivious to the fact that one of its titans was being quietly claimed by an illness no one could name. His wife, Claudine, had retreated into her private chapel, sobbing prayers that would never be answered. His lawyers hovered like crows, updating documents and readying contingencies. But in the hospital cafeteria, someone who had never met Julian Crestwood was scrubbing down a table with a damp cloth, humming a melody that seemed oddly out of place in the sterile gloom. Her name was Liora Hart. 26, working nights to pay for her mother's care. She wore her uniform as if it were woven from silk rather than cheap polyester. She'd noticed the man in Suite 9 long before she ever set foot near his door. Each evening she passed the cluster of white coats gathered around his chart, their pinched faces and clipped words telling her more than any medical journal could. She'd seen enough suffering to know the look of resignation. It was on a night like any other, sleet tapping at the windows, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, when she found herself standing just outside his suite, a tray of chamomile tea balanced on her palm. The nurse who ordered it was nowhere in sight. The guards eyed her suspiciously, but she lifted her chin and spoke with a calm she didn't feel. I was asked to bring this up. He hasn't had anything warm in hours. Perhaps it was the earnest steadiness in her gaze, or the way she cradled the cup as though it held something precious. Whatever it was, they stepped aside. Inside, Julian's breathing was ragged, each inhale a struggle. Leora's heart clenched. She didn't know his story in detail, only that he'd built empires and destroyed rivals with the same cool efficiency. But as she approached the bed, she saw no trace of that legend. Only a man, frail and afraid. Carefully, she set the cup down and turned to leave, but a whisper stopped her. "Stay." His eyelids fluttered, revealing pale eyes that fixed on her face with startling clarity. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he exhaled as though releasing a burden that had been pressing on him for years. "You're not another doctor," he murmured. "No, sir." She tried to smile. "Just a waitress." He closed his eyes again, but there was something almost like relief in his expression. "Then maybe, you won't lie to me." She hesitated, unsure if she should answer. But the quiet plea in his voice dissolved her uncertainty. "I won't." That night, she sat beside his bed long after the tea went cold. She listened as he spoke in broken fragments. Of mistakes he could never undo, of a child he'd lost, of a hunger for something no acquisition could satisfy. Liora felt an ache in her chest, the kind that reminded her how much she wished someone had been there for her mother in her final days. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes the body can't heal because the heart hasn't." He opened his eyes, studying her with a focus none of the doctors had ever received. "What does that mean?" "It means," she swallowed, "it means you're carrying too much. If you want to get better, you need to let go." The words were simple. Childish, perhaps. But they sank into him deeper than any clinical observation. After that night, Liora returned again and again. She never pretended to have answers. She simply listened. She brought herbal compresses her grandmother had taught her to make, pressed them to his temples when the pain became too great. She read to him, poems and stories, the same ones that had once calmed her mother. And slowly, impossibly, something shifted. His fevers began to ebb. The tremors that had plagued him grew less violent. The doctors were baffled, their theories multiplying by the hour. Some suspected a placebo effect. Others whispered about spontaneous remission. But none could explain the way Julian's eyes grew clearer each day, or the way his voice gained strength when he spoke to her. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and turned the hospital walls to gold, he reached for her hand. "You did something none of them could," he whispered. She shook her head, but he tightened his grip. "No, don't deny it. You saw me. Not the name, not the fortune, just me." Tears blurred her vision. She'd spent so long believing she was invisible, a shadow flitting between tables and corridors. Yet here he was, a man who'd been lost to despair, giving her more credit than she'd ever given herself. "I don't know if I'm healed," he said, voice low, "but I feel alive again." She drew in a trembling breath, her heart hammering in her chest. Then maybe that's the beginning. And it was. For in that instant, as the monitors continued their rhythmic pulse and the world outside carried on unknowing, a millionaire and a waitress, two souls divided by every imaginable barrier, found in each other a reason to hope. He didn't release her hand, and she didn't ask him to. In that delicate hush, with the evening light softening the hard edges of the machinery that had failed him so many times, Julian felt the first stirrings of something he had nearly forgotten: faith. Not in science or contracts or the relentless logic that had governed his life, but in the idea that perhaps healing began with being seen. Liora swallowed hard, aware that any moment a nurse or a doctor might barge in and shatter the fragile understanding that had woven itself between them. She thought of her mother, how she used to say that people were like locks, some needed 1,000 keys, others only one gentle touch. She wondered if Julian had simply needed someone who wasn't paid to pretend they cared. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the city flickered in 1,000 electric constellations. "Do you know," he began, his voice tentative, "when I was young, I believed that if I amassed enough power, I could outrun anything, poverty, grief, death itself." "You believed it because it was easier than admitting you were afraid," she said, not unkindly. A hoarse laugh escaped him, startling in the quiet. "Yes, that's exactly it." She looked at him, studying the deep lines etched around his eyes, the fine tremor that still lingered in his fingers. He was a man who had built monuments to his own invincibility, skyscrapers, companies, entire industries. Yet in the end, none of it had shielded him from the same human fragility that claimed everyone. Liora didn't have answers, but she had stories. And so she told him one, about the little house where she'd grown up, the nights she and her mother had counted coins on the kitchen table and made games out of hunger. She told him how, even in their worst moments, her mother would light a candle and insist that there was still beauty to be found in the darkness. "That candle," Liora whispered, "felt like proof that we weren't forgotten." He closed his eyes as if the story were a bomb he'd been waiting for. "No one ever told me things like that," he murmured. "You can hear them now," she said, voice steady. "It's not too late." A nurse peeked in then, her expression one of habitual impatience that shifted to surprise when she saw Julian alert and sitting up. "Mr. Crestwood? You shouldn't be exerting yourself." He didn't look away from Liora. "I'm not exerting. I'm remembering." The nurse frowned, clearly unused to being dismissed, but she retreated without further protest. Julian exhaled a slow, measured breath, as if even that small rebellion had fortified him. "Do you know how many people have tried to save me?" he asked, voice soft. 20 doctors, she replied with a wry smile. "I heard." He studied her, eyes pale and searching. "They tried to fix my body. But you reminded me I had a soul." The words struck her so deeply that for a moment she couldn't find her voice. She had never thought of herself as someone capable of making any real difference. She was a waitress, a daughter, a woman trying to keep herself from drowning under the weight of her own responsibilities. But here, in this improbable place, she had become something more. "Julian," she said quietly, "whatever happens next, you're not alone anymore." For the first time, he didn't look away. The truth in her words rooted itself in him, deeper than any medication or prognosis ever could. A week passed, then 2. Each day, he grew stronger, though the doctors refused to admit they understood why. His medical records were a testament to failure, 1,000 tests and no cure. Yet when Liora walked into the room, he sat straighter, spoke longer, sometimes even smiled. His wife came only once in that time, her eyes glassy with guilt and disbelief. She stood at the foot of the bed and regarded Liora as if she were an interloper in some private tragedy. But Julian had simply introduced her. "This is Liora. She's helping me." Claudine didn't ask what he meant. Perhaps she didn't want to know. She left without touching him. After the door clicked shut, Julian closed his eyes, his face turned to the wall. Liora sat beside him in silence, understanding that some wounds were too old to heal all at once. And then, on a night when the rain fell in silver sheets against the glass, Julian reached for her hand again. "You said once," he began, voice rough, "that letting go was the only way forward. But I don't know how." She didn't pretend to have an easy answer. Instead, she turned her palm upward, letting his trembling fingers settle against hers. "Maybe," she said softly, "we start by forgiving ourselves." He stared at her, the storm reflected in his eyes, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that life had stripped them both bare in different ways. And yet here they were, two unlikely companions in a place neither had chosen. "You've given me more than any doctor," he whispered. "You've given me something too," she replied. A reminder that the smallest kindness can change everything. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside that room, Julian Crestwood began to imagine a world beyond the boundaries of his illness. A world in which healing wasn't measured in charts and scans, but in the quiet absolution of a heart learning to beat without fear. The days that followed unfolded like a delicate miracle neither of them dared to name. Julian's recovery was not the triumphant, cinematic victory the newspapers would later pretend it to be. It was fragile, unpredictable, marked by moments when he faltered, when the old shadows pressed at the edge of his mind, reminding him how easily he could slip back into the darkness he'd inhabited for so long. But each time the fear returned, Liora was there, steady as the dawn. She never demanded that he be braver or stronger than he felt. She never shamed him for the nights when the trembling returned or the mornings when he couldn't find the will to rise from the bed. She simply kept showing up. And slowly, impossibly, he began to believe he deserved that kindness. On an afternoon washed in pale golden light, Julian asked her to wheel him to the rooftop terrace. He hadn't felt the open air in months. As she guided the chair across the worn tiles, she could feel his heart beating fast beneath her hand, as though he, too, wondered if this was all just a fragile dream. But when they reached the railing, when the skyline spread before them in all its indifferent splendor, he closed his eyes and inhaled. The breeze tasted like rain and exhaust and possibility. "Do you know," he said, voice threaded with awe, "I built half this city, but I've never really seen it." Liora rested her hand on his shoulder. "Then see it now." He lifted his gaze, and for a moment, he looked every inch the legend he had once been, except softer, truer, a man who had finally laid down the armor that had cost him so much. He took her hand and didn't let go as he spoke words she knew he had never shared with anyone, words about a father who had taught him that weakness was unforgivable, about the hunger that had driven him to consume everything he touched. He confessed how, even in the height of his power, he had felt hollow. How no amount of wealth had ever soothed the guilt he carried for the son he had lost. How he had come to believe his illness was a kind of punishment he deserved. And when he was done, when the last of those hidden confessions had spilled into the open air, Liora did not flinch or look away. She met his gaze with a quiet steadiness that made his throat ache. "You were never being punished," she said gently. "You were just hurting." The simplicity of her words undid something deep inside him. He had waited decades for absolution from the world, from doctors, from gods he wasn't sure he believed in. But in the end, all it had taken was the soft conviction of a woman who had no reason to care if he lived or died. A woman who had nothing to gain by telling him the truth. They stayed on the terrace until the sun dipped behind the towers. When the chill settled in, she wheeled him back inside, her hand still warm in his. He felt lighter than he had in years. 2 weeks later, the hospital discharged him. The media gathered in a frenzy outside the doors, cameras flashing, reporters clamoring for statements about the miraculous recovery. He emerged in a tailored overcoat that hung loose over his thinner frame, but his eyes were bright and unafraid. When the microphones thrust into his face, demanding to know which doctor had finally saved him, he shook his head. "It wasn't a doctor," he said simply. The reporters pressed closer. "Then who was it?" He turned to where Liora stood by the doors, her uniform crisp, her face flushed with embarrassment. For the first time in her life, she felt truly visible, not as an afterthought, not as a servant, but as someone who mattered. "It was her," Julian said, his voice clear and certain. "She saw the man I'd forgotten how to be." A hush fell over the crowd. Flashes popped like lightning as cameras turned to her. In that instant, the world seemed to tilt. But she didn't shrink away. She stepped to his side and let him take her hand, because no matter how strange this moment was, it was real. Julian turned to her, his expression both grateful and resolute. "I don't know what the future holds," he said quietly enough that only she could hear. "But whatever it is, I'm ready to meet it." "And you won't have to meet it alone," she replied. He nodded, and in that small, unguarded movement, she saw a man reborn, not as an untouchable icon, but as someone willing to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to feel. Around them, the chaos of reporters surged again, but Julian ignored it all. His eyes never left hers. Months later, when he was strong enough to return to his life beyond the hospital, Julian did something no one expected. He closed the doors on several of his companies and restructured others to serve more than just profit. He created a foundation in his son's name to help those whose illnesses had no simple cure. And he appointed Liora, not as an assistant or figurehead, but as the director of community outreach. When the announcement was made, many scoffed that a waitress could never lead such an effort. But Julian only smiled. She's the only one who ever understood what healing really means. Their story became legend, a cautionary tale for those who believed wealth alone could shield them from suffering, and an anthem for those who had ever wondered if their kindness mattered. And though the world moved on, as it always does, Julian and Liora never forgot those long nights when the boundaries between them dissolved, when hope was a fragile thing passed back and forth like a candle in the dark. Sometimes, when the city fell quiet, they would sit together on the terrace of the new rehabilitation center, watching the lights wink on one by one. And in those moments, Julian would reach for her hand, just to remind himself it was real, that a waitress had taught him how to live again, and that no illness, no sorrow, no empire could ever take that away.